The Galactic Navigation Academy stood like a mountain of glass and light on the surface of Desert Prime, its towers reaching so high that they seemed to touch the 3 moons that hung in the purple sky above for 3,000 years. This place had trained the finest navigators in the known galaxy, beings who could calculate the impossible routes between stars, who could thread a ship through the chaos of collapsed gravity wells and burning nebulas without a single mistake. Species from 47-member worlds sent their brightest children here, and those children spent decades learning the sacred mathematics of faster-than-light travel before they were allowed to touch the controls of an actual starship. Today was examination day, and the great hall hummed with nervous energy as 32 candidates took their seats at quantum link calculation terminals that cost more than some planets earned in a year. Instructor Velithcree walked slowly between the rows of terminals, his 6 compound eyes moving independently as he observed each candidate in turn. He was a Morvena, one of the elder races, and his species had been navigating the stars when humans were still learning to make fire in caves. On a small blue world at the edge of the galaxy, his eyes could perceive 11 dimensions of spacetime, and his mind could hold mathematical concepts that would drive lesser beings to madness. Candidates before him represented the finest young minds in the Confederacy. There was Kethorn, a Torvashian whose brain contained 17 parallel processing centers, each one capable of running millions of calculations per second without rest. There was the Kelth Hive pair, 2 beings who shared a single consciousness across their linked minds, working together with perfect synchronization that no single being could ever match. There was his own progeny, Veloth Sara, who showed such promise that the Academy elders had already begun discussing a permanent position for her on the faculty. And then, at Terminal 33, which had been added as an afterthought when the paperwork was finally approved, there was the human Veleth reposed beside her station, his mandibles clicking softly as he studied the small, fragile creature that sat before the terminal. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she had traveled 18 months on a slow freighter to reach Desert Prime because her species did not yet have access to the faster ships that other races took for granted. She had no cranial implant to boost her processing power, no secondary brain lobes for parallel calculation, no genetic modifications to enhance her mathematical ability. She did not even have the basic neural interface that most spacefaring species considered as essential as breathing. What she did have was a worn leather journal filled with handwritten notes, a small photograph of an old woman standing on a boat, and the stubborn determination that seemed to be the only thing humans were actually good at. The other candidates had looked at her with something between pity and contempt when she arrived, whispering to each other in languages she could not understand. Some had laughed openly, unable to believe that such a primitive species had been allowed to send a candidate to the most prestigious navigation school in the galaxy. Elena had ignored them all, keeping her head down and studying harder than anyone else in the preparation courses, even though everyone knew she had no real chance of passing. Velithcree raised his voice so that all candidates could hear him clearly. You will have one standard cycle to calculate a safe route from the Vesser system to the Kepler frontier, he announced, and his words echoed through the great hall like thunder rolling across mountains. 7 days. As you measure time, Cadet Vasquez, he added this last part with a deliberate pause, reminding everyone that the human operated on different scales of time than the more advanced species. Elena raised her hand, and Velithcree felt a flash of irritation at the interruption. "Excuse me, instructor," she said, and her voice was calm, despite the hundreds of eyes now focused on her from around the chamber. 1 week for a single root calculation seems like a very long time. A ripple of clicking and chittering laughter moved through the chamber as the other candidates expressed their amusement at her Ignorance, the Torvashian, made a sound that his species used to indicate embarrassment on behalf of another. Being the Keleth hive pair exchanged a glance that communicated volumes of pit Divleth. Kree's compound eyes swiveled toward her with cold patience, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3,000 years of teaching students who thought they knew better than their instructors. The route to the Kepler frontier passes through the Shattered Veil, he said, and the chamber fell silent at the mention of that terrible place. A region of collapsed gravity wells where dead stars have folded space-time into knots that can crush a ship like paper. Radiation storms that can cook a crew alive inside their own vessel. And temporal eddies where time itself flows backward and forward in ways that can drive even the strongest minds to madness. He moved closer to Elena's terminal, looming over her small form. One miscalculation means death, cadet. Not just for you, but for every soul aboard whatever ship is unfortunate enough to follow your route. His voice dropped lower, taking on an edge that made several candidates flinch. One decimal error, one small mistake in your mathematics, and your ship emerges from faster than light travel inside the heart of a star, vaporized before anyone aboard even knows something has gone wrong. He straightened, addressing the entire chamber once more. This is not a task to be rushed, no matter what your primitive instincts might tell you. And I suggest you spend every moment of your allotted time checking and rechecking your calculations until you are absolutely certain that they are correct. Elena nodded slowly, accepting the rebuke without argument, and looked down at her terminal, where the destination coordinates glowed in soft blue light. She pulled up the star charts. Layers of data showing the positions of stars and planets, the flow of gravity currents, the locations of known hazards and unexplored regions. The Shattered Veil appeared as a dark smear across the display, a wound in space where something terrible had happened long ago, leaving behind a maze of death that claimed ships every year despite the best calculations the Confederacy could produce. But as Elena stared at the swirling patterns of stars and darkness, something stirred in her mind, something old and deep that had nothing to do with mathematics or calculation. It was a feeling she remembered from childhood, from nights spent on her grandmother's fishing boat off the coast of Chile, staring up at the Southern Cross while the old woman told stories about sailors who could find their way home across trackless oceans, using nothing but the stars and their own stubborn hearts. Elena touched the photograph in her pocket, feeling the worn edges of the paper, and whispered words that only she could hear. "Show me the way, Abuela." Then she began to study the star charts in a way that no one in that chamber could possibly understand. 3 days passed inside the examination chamber, and the air itself seemed to grow thick with concentration as 32 candidates worked on the most important test of their lives. The quantum terminals hummed with activity, processing billions of calculations every second as the brightest minds in the galaxy struggled to find a safe path through the nightmare that was the Shattered Veil. Ketharin, the Tavashian prodigy, had filled 17 holographic displays with probability matrices so complex that they seemed to shift and change even as you looked at them. His 17 parallel brain centers worked in perfect harmony, each one attacking a different aspect of the problem while sharing results with the others through neural pathways that had evolved over millions of years specifically for this kind of work. He had already rejected 47 possible routes as too dangerous, and he was now working on his 48th attempt with the patient determination that his species was famous for throughout the galaxy. The Keleth hive pair sat motionless at their joined terminal, their bodies so still that they might have been statues carved from pale blue stone. But beneath that stillness, their shared consciousness blazed with activity. Two minds working as one to process variables and calculate outcomes at speeds that made even the Torvashian look slow by comparison. They communicated through their neural link in concepts rather than words, sharing understanding in ways that single-minded beings could never truly comprehend. Valethus, the Morvani prodigy and child of the instructor himself, had entered a state of deep meditation that her species called the seeing. All 6 of her eyes had rolled back in her skull, showing only pale membranes, and her consciousness had expanded beyond her physical form to touch the quantum substrate of space-time itself. In this state, she could perceive the shape of the universe directly, feeling the curves and folds of reality as clearly as a human might feel the texture of silk against their skin. She was not calculating a route so much as experiencing one, letting the mathematics of existence flow through her mind, like water through a riverbed. These were the finest young navigators in the Confederacy, beings who had trained their entire lives for this moment, and they worked with focus and determination that would have exhausted any human within. Ours and Elena Vasquez was staring out the window. She had been sitting at her terminal for 3 days now, and in all that time, she had entered exactly 0 calculations into the system. Her display showed the same star charts she had pulled up at the beginning of the examination, unchanged and untouched, while the cursor blinked patiently in an empty input field. Instead of working, she spent her time looking through the great glass walls of the examination chamber at the star-filled sky of Vesser Prime, her eyes distant and unfocused, as if she was seeing something that no one else in the room could perceive. Some of the other candidates had started making jokes about her, whispering that the human had given up, that she knew she had no chance and was simply waiting for the examination to end so she could go home in shame. Others felt a strange kind of pity, wondering if perhaps the pressure had broken her mind and she had retreated into some kind of waking coma rather than face the impossibility of the task before her. Valeth Cree had watched her with growing irritation. As the days passed, his compound eyes returning to her terminal again and again, as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. On the morning of the 4th day, he could contain himself no longer. "Cadet," his voice cut through the quiet hum of the chamber like a blade through silk, and Elena turned from the window to face him with an expression of calm that seemed entirely inappropriate for someone who was failing the most important examination of her life. "Your terminal shows no calculations," Valeth Cree said, moving to stand directly in front of her station where everyone in the chamber could see him. "No progress of any kind, no attempts to map the route. Nothing but the same basic star charts you pulled up 3 days ago." He let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the weight of his disappointment fill the air. "You have consumed nearly half your allotted time, and you have nothing to show for it but 3 days of staring at the sky like a child watching clouds." "I know," Elena said, and her voice was steady despite the hundreds of eyes now watching her with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. "I am thinking." Valeth Cree repeated the word as if it was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard in his 3,000 years of teaching. "You are thinking while every other candidate in this chamber works themselves to exhaustion trying to solve a problem that has claimed the lives of thousands of navigators over the centuries." He moved closer, his 6 eyes focusing on her with an intensity that made some of the other candidates look away in discomfort. "The route to the Kepler frontier requires the integration of over 40,000 gravitational variables, Cadet, each one capable of changing the outcome of your calculation. If you get it wrong by even the smallest fraction," his voice rose with each point he made, filling the chamber with the force of his frustration, "you must account for stellar drift, the slow movement of stars over time that changes the shape of safe passages through dangerous space. And you must calculate these changes precisely enough to know where each star will be when your ship passes through. Not where they are now or where they were when the charts were made." He began pacing back and forth in front of her terminal, his movements sharp and agitated. "You must factor in dark matter currents, invisible rivers of gravitational force that flow through the galaxy in patterns that even our most advanced instruments can barely detect. Currents that can push a ship off course by millions of kilometers if you fail to account for their influence. His voice dropped to something cold and hard, and you must calculate the probability cascade of quantum navigation itself. The fundamental uncertainty that exists at the heart of faster-than-light travel. The chaos that makes every junk through folded space a gamble with the lives of everyone aboard. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the complex facets of his compound eyes, reflecting her own face back at her in fragments. Your species has been spacefaring for barely 2 centuries. Cadet, a heartbeat in the life of the galaxy. And in that time, you have contributed nothing of significance to the science of navigation. His mandibles clicked in a pattern that conveyed deep contempt. What could you possibly be thinking that would substitute for proper calculation? For the mathematics that has guided ships through the stars since before your ancestors climbed down from the trees on your homeworld. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. A stillness that had nothing to do with defeat when she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but somehow filled the entire chamber. Do you know how my ancestors crossed oceans, instructor? Back before computers and satellites and all the technology that your species probably takes for granted. Velithkri's eyes narrowed, but he did not interrupt her. They looked at the sky, Elena continued, and there was something ancient in her words. Something that reached back through generations of her bloodline. They watched how the stars moved through the seasons, tracking patterns that took years to recognize and lifetimes to truly understand. She turned to look out the window at the stars burning against the velvet darkness of space. They felt the current beneath their boats and the wind against their faces. They watched the flight of birds and the color of the water. And something in their bones knew the way home even when their minds could not explain. How? Velithkri's mandibles twitched. And for just a moment, something flickered in his compound eyes that might have been uncertainty. Superstition, he said. But the word lacked the force of his earlier condemnations. The examination continues. I suggest you begin your calculations before you run out of time entirely. He turned and walked away. But not before Elena saw something in his posture, a stiffness that had not been there before. As if her words had touched something he did not want to acknowledge, she watched him go. Then turned back to the window, where a billion stars burned cold and eternal against the darkness, and she let her mind fall into them like a stone dropping into deep water, sinking down through layers of conscious thought until she reached something older and deeper, something that had guided her ancestors across trackless oceans and would guide her now across the trackless void between stars. That night, Elena dreamed of her grandmother. She was 7 years old again, small and thin and full of questions that never seemed to stop, sitting on the worn wooden deck of her grandmother's fishing boat as it rocked gently on the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean. The sky above them was a river of stars. More stars than Elena had ever seen from the city where she lived with her parents. So many stars that they seemed to form a solid band of light stretching from horizon to horizon. Abul Rosa sat beside her, her weathered hands resting on the old wooden wheel that guided their boat through waters her family had fished for generations. She was 73 years old, her face lined with decades of sun and salt and hard work. But her eyes were sharp and clear as they traced patterns in the sky that young Elena could not yet see. Look there, Mia, the old woman said, pointing at a cluster of stars that seemed no different from any other cluster to Elena's untrained eyes. That is the Southern Cross, the same stars that guided our people across the ocean when there were no maps and no instruments. Nothing but the sky and the sea and the courage to keep sailing even when everything seemed lost. Elena squinted at the stars, trying to see what her grandmother saw, but they were just points of light to her. Beautiful but meaningless. How did they know where to go, Abuela? She asked. How could they find their way with just stars to guide them? Her grandmother was quiet for a long moment. And when she spoke again, her voice had taken on a different quality. Deeper and more serious than Elena had ever heard before. The stars are not just lights, Mia. They are not just fire burning in the sky millions of kilometers away. She turned to look at Elena, and in her eyes was something ancient. Something that had been passed down through countless generations of her bloodline. They are a map. A song. A story written across the heavens by forces older than our world. And you do not read them with your mind. She placed her hand over Elena's heart, pressing firmly enough that the girl could feel her own pulse beating against her. Grandmother's palm. You feel them with your blood. You listen with your bones. And when you learn to truly hear what they are telling you, you will never be lost again, no matter how far from home you travel. Elena woke in her quarters on Nesser, Prime with her heart pounding and tears streaming down her face. The dream was already fading, slipping away like water through her fingers, but something remained. Something solid and real that had nothing to do with memory. It was a pattern, a sense of rightness that lived somewhere beneath conscious thought. A knowing that did not require understanding. She lay in the darkness of her small room, listening to the hum of alien technology all around her. And for the first time since arriving at the academy, she did not feel alone because she understood now what the other species did not. What they could not understand, no matter how advanced their mathematics or how powerful their technology. The Morvani had evolved as apex predators on a world of eternal daylight. A world where 3 suns kept the sky bright at all hours, and darkness was something that existed only in stories they had never needed to navigate by. Starlight, because starlight had never been part of their existence. And so they had developed their incredible mathematical abilities instead, learning to calculate what others learned to feel. The Tovashans came from a binary star system where the movements of their 2 suns created patterns so regular and predictable that their entire culture was built on mathematical certainty for them. The universe was a vast equation waiting to be solved, and they had become the finest calculators in the galaxy, because calculation was all they had ever needed. The Keleth were not even a natural species in the way that humans understood the term. They had been engineered for space by their creators millions of years ago, designed from the ground up for life among the stars, with every aspect of their biology optimized for the task of navigation. They did not learn to navigate so much as execute programs that had been written into their genetic code before they were even born. But humans were different. Humans had crawled out of the African savanna with nothing but soft bodies and clever hands. The weakest and slowest of all the great apes. Prey animals in a world filled with predators that could kill them without effort. They had survived not through strength or speed or natural weapons, but through pattern recognition, the ability to see a rustle in the grass and know without thinking that death was coming. To hear a distant sound and understand immediately what it meant. That same instinct, honed over millions of years of running and hiding and desperately trying to survive, had let them read the stars when they finally looked up at the night sky. It had let them navigate by the sun when they left their homeland and spread across the world. It had let them cross oceans in wooden boats by watching the flight of birds and the color of the water and the way the waves moved beneath their hulls. 10,000 generations of survivors had burned that gift into human DNA, writing it into every cell of their bodies in a language older than words. The stars were not data to be processed by quantum computers and probability matrices. They were home, a map written in fire and light that every human carried in their blood, whether they knew it or not. Elena got up from her bed and dressed in the darkness, not bothering to turn on the lights because she did not need them. She walked through the quiet corridors of the academy, past sleeping candidates and humming machines, until she reached the examination chamber where her terminal waited with its blank input field and its blinking cursor. The great glass walls showed the stars of Desert Prime in all their alien glory. Constellations she did not recognize, patterns she had never seen before. But as she sat down and let her eyes relax, let her mind sink down into that place beneath conscious thought where her grandmother's wisdom lived, the strangeness began to fade, because stars were stars. No matter how far from Earth you traveled, they burned with the same fire, followed the same laws, traced the same patterns across the sky that they had traced since the universe was young, and somewhere in Elena's blood, in the deepest parts of her being where instinct lived alongside memory, something stirred and recognized them. She closed her eyes and let her ancestors guide her. All those generations of sailors and travelers and survivors who had never stopped looking up, never stopped reaching for the next horizon, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, the route to the Kepler frontier began to take shape. Not as a calculation, but as a feeling, a path that she could see without seeing, that she knew without understanding. The stars were singing to her, just as her grandmother had promised they would. And Elena Vasquez was finally ready to listen. On the final day of the examination, the great hall was filled with tension so thick it seemed to have weight. Instructor Velithcree stood at the front of the chamber, his 6 compound eyes moving slowly across the rows of candidates who had spent 7 days pushing their minds to the absolute limit of their capabilities. Most of them looked exhausted, drained by the effort of wrestling with a problem that had no easy solutions. But there was pride in their expressions as well. The satisfaction of having given everything they had to the task, one by one. He called them forward to present their routes. Ketharon, the Torvashan prodigy, was the first to stand before the assembly. His 17 holographic displays flickered to life around him, showing a route of elegant mathematical precision that curved gently through the safest regions of space, avoiding the shattered veil entirely by taking a longer path around its outer edges. The journey will take 9 standard days, he announced, his voice carrying the confidence of absolute certainty, with minimal exposure to gravitational anomalies and a safety margin of 12% above Confederacy standards. Velithcree studied the route for a long moment, his eyes tracing every curve and calculation. Approved, he said finally. And Ketharon returned to his seat with his head held high. The Caliph Hive pair rose next, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization as they approached the display area. Their route was more ambitious than the Torvashans, cutting through the outer edge of the shattered veil rather than avoiding it entirely. 7 days travel time, they said in unison, their voices blending into a single sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, with acceptable risk levels based on current stellar drift calculations. Velithcree's eyes narrowed as he examined their work, looking for flaws in their mathematics, but finding none. Approved with commendation, he announced. And the Hive pair returned to their station with expressions of quiet satisfaction. Then Velithzara, his own child and the pride of his lineage, stepped forward. The chamber fell completely silent as she activated her display, because everyone knew that the Morvani prodigy had been working on something extraordinary, something that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. Her route appeared on the main screen, and a collective gasp echoed through the hall where others had avoided the shattered veil or skimmed its edges. Velithzara had threaded directly through its heart, finding a path between the collapsed stars and gravity wells that no one had ever mapped before. 5 days, she said, and her voice was calm despite the magnitude of what she had achieved. Through a corridor I have identified using quantum substrate analysis, with safety parameters that meet all Confederacy requirements. The chamber erupted in sounds of amazement, clicking and humming and whistling as candidates from a dozen different species expressed their astonishment at what the young Morvani had accomplished it. Velikrit examined the route with all 6 of his eyes, checking every calculation, every assumption, every variable that went into the probability matrices, approved with highest honors, he said at last, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. This is work worthy of the finest navigators in the Confederacy's history. Velith Zara returned to her seat amid continued sounds of acclaim, and Velith Kree turned to face the remaining candidates. "Is there anyone else who wishes to present a route?" he asked. Though his tone suggested he considered the examination effectively over, Elena Vasquez stood up. The sound of acclaim died away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence as everyone remembered the human who had spent most of the examination staring out the window. Some candidates shifted in their seats, embarrassed on her behalf, while others watched with the cruel curiosity of those who enjoy seeing others. Felvolathre's mandibles clicked in a pattern that conveyed weary resignation. "Cadet Vasquez," he said, "you may present your work." Elena walked to the front of the chamber, and she carried nothing with her except a small data chip that she inserted into the main display terminal. She had no holographic displays showing complex mathematics, no probability matrices or gravitational calculations, no evidence of the kind of work that the other candidates had spent 7 days producing. Instead, a single image appeared on the main screen. It was a hand-drawn line, simple and clean, connecting Desser Prime to the Kepler frontier in a path that wove through the shattered veil like thread passing through the eye of a needle. The chamber was absolutely silent. "Cadet Vasquez," Velith Kree said slowly, and his voice had taken on a dangerous edge, "explain your methodology." Elena turned to face the assembly, and her eyes moved across the room, meeting the gazes of beings who had dismissed her, who had laughed at her, who had never for a moment believed that she belonged among them. "There is a current," she said, and her voice was steady despite the hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. "A flow in the gravity wells that everyone has been treating as obstacles." She gestured at her route on the screen. "The collapsed stars, the dead suns that make the shattered veil so dangerous, they are not just hazards to be avoided. They are waypoints to be used." She moved closer to the display, tracing her path with one finger. "You use their gravitational pull to accelerate. Slingshot around them at precisely the right angle, and let the tide of warped space-time carry you forward like a leaf floating on a river through rapids." The silence stretched on for so long that Elena began to wonder if anyone would ever speak again. Then Velith Zara rose from her seat, her 6 eyes wide with something that might have been shock or outrage. "That is impossible," she said, and her voice cracked with emotion. "The gravitational mathematics alone would require calculations that no being could complete in 7 days. The variables are too complex, the margins for error too small. I did not use mathematics," Elena said simply. "I used instinct." The chamber exploded into noise, shouting and clicking and humming as candidates expressed their disbelief and anger at what they were hearing. Velithri raised one hand for silence, and the noise died away, though the tension remained thick enough to taste. "Transfer your route to the simulation system," he commanded. "Let us see what the computers make of your instinct." Elena nodded and initiated the transfer. The main display flickered as the Academy's most powerful computers began analyzing her route, running it through simulation after simulation, testing it against every known hazard. In the shattered veil, travel time appeared on the screen. 18 hours. The chamber went silent again. 18 hours. Compared to the 5 days that Velith Zara had achieved with the finest mathematical mind of her generation, the simulation continued, checking safety parameters, calculating risk assessments, evaluating every aspect of the route against Confederacy standards. And then an error message appeared: RISK assessment. Unable to calculate parameters outside standard evaluation, RNG. The System could not evaluate it because the route was so far outside normal parameters that the safety algorithms had no frame of reference for understanding what Elena had created. Valethri stepped forward. All 6 eyes focused on Elena with an intensity that seemed to press against her skin like physical weight. You are asking us to approve a route that our most advanced systems cannot verify, he said, and his voice was very quiet. A route that no computer in the Confederacy can evaluate for safety. Yes, Elena said, based on nothing but human intuition. Nothing but the feelings of a species that has been spacefaring for barely 2 centuries. Elena met his gaze without flinching, based on 50,000 years of looking at the sky and finding our way home, she said. Based on every human who ever crossed an ocean in a wooden boat or found their way through a desert by watching the stars. Based on a gift that my species paid for in blood and survival across more generations than your computers can count. She touched the screen where her route glowed against the darkness of space. This path is safe. Instructor, I know it the same way I know how to breathe. And if your systems cannot verify it, then perhaps your systems need to learn something new. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. 1 month after the examination, the Confederacy survey vessel Pathfinder dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler frontier. Ship hung motionless in space for a long moment as its systems confirmed what the crew already knew. That they had arrived at their destination safely. That every soul aboard was alive and well. That the impossible had become possible. The journey had taken 17 hours and 43 minutes, 0 casualties, 0 system failures, 0 moments of danger that required emergency protocols. That Peter's ship had ridden the gravity currents of the shattered veil exactly as Elena had predicted, dancing between collapsed stars and dead suns like a leaf carried on a gentle stream, accelerating through curves that the mathematics said should be deadly, but somehow were not. Captain Morris stood on the bridge with his 4 arms folded across his chest, his Tervashian features arranged in an expression that mixed disbelief with something that might have been wonder. He had commanded ships through the shattered veil before, following routes that took weeks and still claimed lives despite the best calculations. His navigators could produce this journey had been different from the first. Moment they entered the veil, the ship had moved with a smoothness he had never experienced, as if the universe itself was guiding them forward, as if they were exactly where they were supposed to be at every moment of the journey. He found Elena in the observation deck, standing before a vast window that looked out on the unfamiliar stars of the Kepler frontier. She was alone, her reflection ghostly in the glass, her eyes tracing patterns in the stars that he could not see. The Confederacy has been trying to find a fast route through the veil for 3 centuries, he said, and his voice was rough with emotion he did not try to hide. Our best minds have worked on the problem for longer than your species has been walking upright. Our most powerful computers have run simulations that would take a human lifetime to complete. He moved to stand beside her, following her gaze out into the darkness. And you did it in your head in 7 days, with nothing but a pen and paper and whatever it is that humans do when they stare at stars. Elena shook her head slowly. Not in my head, she said, and her voice was soft but filled with something that made the old captain feel very young. In my bones, in my blood. In every human who ever looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there waiting to be discovered. She pressed her hand against the viewport. Her fingers splayed against the cold glass as if she could reach out and touch the stars burning in the distance. We did not evolve for space, Captain. We evolved afraid. She turned to look at him, and in her eyes was something ancient, something that had been forged in the fires of survival across millions of years. We evolved running from predators that were faster and stronger than us, hiding in caves from creatures that could tear us apart without effort. watching the darkness with terror because we knew what lived in it. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, filled with a pride that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than herself. And somewhere along the way, in all those generations of fear and survival, we learned to look up. We learned to find patterns in the chaos of the night sky. We learned to feel our way through the darkness using nothing but the stars and our stubborn, desperate will to live. She smiled, and in that smile was the ghost of her grandmother. Of all the sailors and travelers and survivors who had come before her, the universe is full of species smarter than us. Captain, species with bigger brains and better technology and millions more years of evolution to refine their abilities. She gestured at the stars beyond the window. The Morvani can perceive dimensions of reality that we cannot even imagine. The Tuvashans can calculate trajectories that would take us centuries to understand. The Keleth were designed by beings so advanced that they might as well have been gods. She dropped her hand back to her side. But none of them ever had to be lost the way we were lost. None of them ever had to find their way home across an ocean with nothing but the stars and their own hearts to guide them. None of them ever had to face the darkness with no weapons except hope and determination and the absolute refusal to give up. She turned back to the window, and the light of a billion suns reflected in her eyes. That is the human gift. Captain, we do not calculate the path the way your people do. We do not see it the way the Morvani see it. We do not know it the way the Keleth know it. Her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but somehow it seemed to fill the entire observation deck. We feel it, and we never ever stop reaching for the next horizon. Captain Morith was silent for a long time, processing her words, trying to understand something that his mathematical mind had never been designed to comprehend. "What will you do now?" he finally asked. Elena smiled again, and this time there was excitement in her expression, the eagerness of someone who has found their purpose and cannot wait to pursue it. "There are other routes that need finding," she said. "Other paths through impossible places that your calculations say cannot be crossed. Other frontiers waiting for someone to show the way." She pulled the worn photograph from her pocket. The image of an old woman standing on a fishing boat under a sky full of stars. "My grandmother used to say that the universe is an ocean, and we are all just sailors trying to find our way home." She tucked the photograph away and straightened her uniform. "I think she was right. And I think it is time for humans to show the galaxy how sailors navigate." 3 years after the Pathfinder's historic voyage, human navigators had become the most sought-after specialists in the entire Confederacy. They called it star sense, or the human touch. This ability to find paths that no computer could calculate and no mathematics could explain. Scientists from 100 different worlds studied it, trying to understand how it worked, trying to replicate it in machines and genetic modifications and quantum algorithms. They all failed because what they were trying to recreate was not a skill that could be taught or a talent that could be engineered. It was a scar. The beautiful, terrible mark left by millions of years of being small and afraid in a vast, uncaring cosmos. It was the gift of the hunted, the inheritance of survivors, the reward for all those generations of humans who had looked up at the darkness and refused to look away, and it could not be copied or calculated or created in a laboratory, because it was not something humans had learned to do. It was something they had become, written into their very souls by the universe itself. Elena Vasquez went on to chart 17 impossible routes through regions of space that the Confederacy had written off as impassable, opening new frontiers and connecting worlds that had been separated since the beginning of recorded history. And every time she stood before a window, looking out at unfamiliar stars, she would touch the photograph in her pocket and whisper the same words her grandmother had taught her so many years ago. "The stars are not just lights, Mia. They are a map, a song, a story written across the heavens, and you feel them with your blood."